Hi, everyone. I swear we didn't plan the matching green shirts thing, but that's all right. I'm honored to be mistaken for Nicholas. So I'm an ethnobotanist, and I've been doing ethnographic and ecological work for about 15 years, and I've found that those two pursuits are really one and the same. So effective conservation takes a biocultural approach that recognizes biological and cultural diversity are inextricable. So the conservation of nature, of the environment, of biodiversity requires conservation of human communities. There's a myth that human beings are only negative influence on the environment, and that we can only mitigate the harm. But really, when you look at human history, most human communities have had regenerative relationships with the land. This island where we're gathered now has the name that comes from the Algonquin language of the Lenape people, who once farmed and fished and rotated their villages carefully throughout the years so that the land would continually renew and rejuvenate. And I come from the Chesapeake Bay watershed. This is another region with a different Algonquin-speaking people, the Powhatan Nation. And this is a watershed that's framed, it's a basin framed by the Appalachian Mountains, the temperate rainforests of Appalachia, where I spent a lot of time. But in 2014, I traveled from those rainforests down to the rainforests in Ecuador, where I began the work that would bring me here 8 years later. And I'm here to talk about IRI. So this is short for the Indigenous Reciprocity Initiative of the Americas, excuse me. And this is a community-led program of Chacruna, and it consists of indigenous and local organizations that are engaged in different projects, fighting for food and water security, for environmental health, land rights, cultural sovereignty. And the thread that connects all these different projects is that they're all self-determined by local people, designed and implemented by indigenous communities to meet their own needs and priorities, rather than something being imposed from the outside. And the other unique element is that all of the funding is unconditional, so it's completely controlled by the communities. There's another thread that connects the crises these communities confront, and this is the cultural and economic system that alienates and commodifies every part of our inner and outer worlds. So IRI, or IRI, is informed by an investigation of this system, the cultural conditioning, the cosmological concepts, the deeply held unconscious beliefs about the nature of reality that underlie these supposedly secular and objective. So this is what I'll refer to as our ontology. This is our experience of reality, our sense of what reality is. Our ontological perspective influences our attitudes and behaviors, and the efficacy of our approaches to science, our efforts to bring healing to individuals, to communities, to environments. And I want to ask, what can we learn from relational ontologies that inform an entirely different sense of relationships? So a society of beings where reciprocity is the main mode of relating. So reciprocity is something that can only happen within a system of relationship between beings who recognize each other as subjects with agency. So how do we see others, not only other human beings, but other organisms, trees, forests, fungi, rivers, organic compounds, and then how do they see us? How other kinds of beings see us matters, and the fact that other kinds of beings see us challenges this nature-culture division that we're conditioned to feel by a dominant form of thinking, this dominant ontology or story that we're living in. So if we are forced to recognize that seeing and representing, knowing, and thinking are not exclusive to human beings, this colonial story starts to fall apart. In the global north, there's a perspective, Brazilian anthropologist Mauro Almeida calls this the monetary ontology. So the wealth and power centers that weaponize scientific institutions to reap the benefits of ethnopharmacological discoveries generated by indigenous people and dismissing the indigenous ontological perspective. This is a contradiction that results in the degradation of forests and communities by the same forces who profit from them. So by engaging with a different story that views forests as living, thinking networks, all other beings as subjects with their own minds and agency, we recognize local autonomy and we ensure the protection of valuable resources of biocultural diversity, ecological knowledge, And when we reflect this understanding in our work, then we can begin to approach something resembling reciprocity with our partners. This is Don Ricardo. He is an Indigenous Yanesha elder in the community of Sachopen in central Peru, and he was one of my closest friends and interlocutors during my graduate fieldwork. And the first time I interviewed Ricardo, he brought me to what he called his office next to his herb garden, his chili pepper fields, and we sat on some wooden stools he had built decades ago in the shade of some Ocumanos or Podocarpus species. And this is what he called his designated interview area. And he would always tease me and say that he was going to charge me 100 soles per hour for our interviews. But Ricardo was the former Cornesha, or the leader of this community, and he had spent a long time in that position. He'd even traveled to the US at some summits and hadn't really seen how a positive benefit or effect or impact of that work on his community. And what he really was interested in from me was sharing my research, sharing my recordings, my videos, my photos. And at one point when we were deep in conversation, we were interrupted by a chorus of Sidicine birds singing in the branches above us. And Ricardo immediately lit up. He stopped, paused, pointed it out, and he said, "Listen to the little parrots. It's not always like this. It's not so common. It means this is a good moment, and that they only sing this way sometimes. You don't always see them around." In his 70s, Ricardo remembered when this birdsong was much more common. He lived through the deforestation of the Chorobamba River Valley, persecution by Franciscan missionaries, displacement by colonos, and then ongoing violence and discrimination. And he still welcomed him with open arms, and despite his long life, he was still harvesting coffee when I was spending time with him. And whether he was harvesting coffee or in his garden or in his office or watching a boxing match on TV, he was always listening. He was always in communication with the forest, which is speaking to us whether we hear it or not. So in the 20th century, social scientists began to hint at concepts long embedded within traditional ecological knowledge. So Don Ricardo's communication with the birds in his garden, it touches on this world described by ethnographer Eduardo Viveros de Castro as perspectivism. So this is an ontology that views all of life as an ecology of subjective selves. And this ontological turn is a movement that seeks to center that difference in ontological perspective, as well as multi-species ethnography. So going beyond the human, reorganizing these subject-object, nature-culture hierarchies and dichotomies. And this idea of forests as thinking networks, or of nature itself as minded or mind-manifesting, is really backed up by all of the data on plants which hear and emit sounds, store information, learn and respond to events around them, and communicate with each other and other species. So once again, the interpretation and use of science that hold meaning is not exclusive to humans or even animals. And this point of view, psychedelic as it sounds, can be applied directly to science and other colonial legacies like philanthropy. So ontology's relation to indigenous knowledge is both medicinal and ecological. Indigenous and local territories have more biodiversity than national parks and nature preserves due to a careful study of their environment that is understood to be a living being. So these are empirically effective management strategies, empirically effective medicines. They result from this ontology that allows for non-human intelligence at the level of the forest, of the organism or the organic compound. And it runs counter to this dominant ontology that holds a nature-culture, mind-body, subject-object dichotomy as something that's borne out in the natural world, and then treats indigenous people as extensions of nature to be prospected. So our work has to recognize that local knowledge really comes from countless generations of careful study. And there's a fundamental contradiction at the heart of biomedicine and the sources of funding that fuel it, benefiting from countless medicinal advancements originating from indigenous communities while ignoring their rights. So there's something called the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing, which is often invoked today as a way to protect indigenous knowledge. And it relies on this framework of intellectual property. And in the vast majority of cases, this has failed to protect the cultural and environmental resources of indigenous people from extraction and exploitation, and in some cases even facilitate it, rather than alternatives like liberatory licenses or IP commons, IP abolition. The hopes in Nagoya still tend to represent a top-down and profit-driven model that could potentially continue reproducing the same disparities and power imbalances and not really challenge these colonial structures. So the biocultural approach really suggests that the recognition of personhood in natural systems seems to have a positive impact on the environment. But indigenous cultures are not a monolith, and they have never been static and cannot be expected to provide solutions to the problems industrialized nations created while bearing the brunt of the consequences. As land becomes less available, space that was once dedicated to diverse polycultural forest gardens has to be dedicated to cash crops. So this is Eduardo Don Ricardo's son-in-law, another close friend, and he's showing off his organic coffee. He's very proud of. It's part of an agroforestry project that our program funds. And for Eduardo, growing coffee in an organic way is as his ancestors would have grown it, even though it's a non-native plant. And Eduardo is also a songkeeper who teaches traditional dance and story. And one of his fellow coffee growers put it this way. He said, "Many criticize us and tell us that as Yanesha, we must not forget our custom and our culture, that we should live in our humble house, eating fish and wild animals. But will Yanesha live from that? Our coffee is now our black gold. It is the only thing that gives us the economic means to survive. We are in the 21st century, and Yanesha is now able to be an entrepreneur. But this does not mean that you forget your culture, that we forget our identity. If a brother invites you to take Masato, you cannot refuse. You cannot be ashamed." So many in the psychedelic space and the philanthropy space, well-meaning people, prefer to see indigenous people in a way that is convenient for them, and perhaps are not as in tune with the material realities of the communities that they may seek to support or create relationships with. And I think that this tendency to reduce and oversimplify is related to something Karl Marx called the metabolic rift. This is a social and ecological alienation from the resources by which we survive and the natural world that produces them, and then the communities whose sacrifices bring those resources to us. So if we look at the distributed intelligence of a forest, we see that this view is much more applicable to ecosystem. This biocultural approach reflects our growing understanding of intelligence in nature. This idea of thinking forests, this interconnectedness of the natural world, is reflected in the merging of social, ecological, and political spheres. So all political problems are ecological problems. Relational ontologies, focusing on relationships and ecologies, these recognize that greater community autonomy results in greater carbon storage capacity, greater biodiversity, all these environmental metrics that are found in greater abundance in indigenous and local territories. This points to the potential of a grassroots approach that reflects this forest thinking system that prioritizes ecological relationships, that makes knowledge of plants inseparable from people, and can really be applied to building new models of funding. So models that reflect the interconnectivity of natural systems that are hinted at in the psychedelic experience. So how can we change our culture, our ontology? How do we build things differently? How do we give back, integrate, and act? For us, and in our work, we've built something called ERIE, and when we launched it in April of 2021, unfortunately, the same month that Don Ricardo passed away, but I have been able to, I've had the privilege of being in contact with all of his extended family and seeing how this program has changed the autonomy and the ability to be autonomous and independent and self-determined within Saint-Tropez and in other communities. So this is a community-directed biocultural conservation program connecting directly with grassroots indigenous organizations at the local level with the aim of giving back to the cultural regions that support indigenous plant use and knowledge. So this is a pool of funds that supports local indigenous initiatives with no strings attached. And so I'm gonna just wrap up really quickly and set up this video that is from our recent field work in Mexico with some of our indigenous partners, the Mazatec And this is just one example, but all of the projects that are supported involve tree planting, involve fights for land tenure, for community mapping, for supporting whatever the community has determined is their priority so that they can have a position of empowerment, of autonomy and security, and then they can dictate what relationships they have with outsiders. So Erie is self-managed by communities. It can address immediate needs. And as I said before, this summer we spent time with our partners in the Sierra Mazateca as well as the Birikuta Desert and conducted a lot of collaborative interviews, tried to co-create spaces for dialogue around the impacts of the psychedelic renaissance on indigenous communities, as well as the idea of reciprocity or lack thereof. So this video that we're about to play is a clip of Cipripacma. This is an organization in the Sierra Mazateca. The speakers include Eloy, who is an ethnolinguist, a Mazatec ethnolinguist who's working on conserving different varieties of Mazatec within the region, as well as the leader Heriberto and their treasurer Laura. And so I think I'm going to just go ahead and turn it over to them to close.
Que se dé esta conciencia ahora de manera recíproca, pero con toda la gente que de alguna forma ya llegó a la Sierra Mazateca, ya conoció el conocimiento ancestral que nuestros abuelos aún conservan. No nada más fue con los hongos sagrados cuando este etnólogo hizo acto de presencia hace más de 100 años con la sacerdotisa María Sabina, porque fue allí el parteaguas de todo esto. Hoy en día, tristemente nos enteramos que también la hoja pastora y otras plantas medicinales siguen siendo sustraídas, siguen siendo analizadas, cuál es su elemento activo que ayuda a la salud. Nosotros no estamos en contra de que se explore eso, sino que esas empresas que tienen esos proyectos, que tienen miras aquí hacia nosotros, que sean recíprocos con nuestra gente, que el apoyo sea recíproco, que no sea nada más de venir, llevarse y de ahí ya no sepamos nada de ellos.
Pues ya tenemos un rato que venimos trabajando. Tenemos varios grupos en diferentes municipios, Tenango, de aquí de Santa María Chilchocla, en diferentes comunidades. Pues venimos rescatando la lengua, porque pues ya, de hecho ya los grandes somos los que lo hablamos, ya la nueva generación ya no lo habla. Entonces, también pues a través de Dios, como había dicho Heriberto, a través de los honguitos, la sangre de Cristo son los que nos ilumina un paso a dar.
La madre tierra es como una persona, es nuestra madre, vive y tiene necesidades como nosotros. Tiene sus brazos, su cabeza, sus miembros, su ombligo. Ahí en el ombligo es donde está la vida más latente, diríamos. Ella vive y necesitamos relacionarnos con ella, hablar con ella, y a veces nos olvida.
Okay, folks, as you know, you can turn your badge and you will see a QR code, and there you can find Ask a Question. So I ask you all to go there and post your question. You can also vote the questions you like more. And I guess I'm gonna start doing my own questions to Nick and Joe. I think the new author that I'm quoting is Kevin Baltic. I don't remember exactly his expression, talking about white pale, was that it, Kevin? White male pale. So the question is, why should we care to listen to two white guys talking about indigenous people? And gotta keep you on a string, so what do you got for me?
You shouldn't. I would say there's no necessarily value in listening to us in particular, but I would say that my goal is to recognize the gifts that I have, the blessings that I've been given, and how can I use them best to serve. And we've spent years developing these relationships of trust with our partners, and they've placed a lot of responsibility on us to carry this work forward, and so I'm going to honor that as best I can, but I certainly am not unaware of my position in that context.
Yeah, and I would just add that kind of I'm speaking as an anthropologist, and I think anthropology is a really key discipline to help kind of work through some of these problems. Like because of these common tropes I was talking about, we project these onto the Mazatec without really understanding and taking seriously what Mazatec people are saying about their sacred plants and mushrooms. This idea that they're interlocutors, they're subject, they're invested with personhood. So I think, well, this is not really related to being a white person, but I think anthropology, which I can offer, helps kind of cross-culturally translate some of these ideas. So yeah, that's my answer.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to add that also as a Brazilian and middle-class person from South America, we are often faced with a lot of challenges regarding identity politics in the United States that has a system of classification of race that doesn't translate in equal ways to the ways that race is classified in South America. And I think the main important thing that I want to point out about our project is that we as Chacruna are not telling local people what to do, and our philanthropy, our grassroots philanthropy program is mainly offering the funds we can get from the global north and share with these communities, but they are the ones responsible for decision making and where to spend the money and how to spend it. And part of this idea of decolonizing philanthropy is that we're not asking them to show us decks or to prove their worth or to show why they merit these donations, but the burden is it's on us to find the organizations that we consider trustworthy and we have established relationships with them and support them on their own terms, which is frankly a little revenge that we have by dealing with philanthropists in the global north who frequently want to impose their agendas onto the people on the ground. So that's a little bit the gist of the spirit of the program. And I want to ask Selena a very generic question. First, I just want to say that in my twisted anthropologic brain, the data that really called more attention for me in your presentation is that almost 1/4 of the people that are sitting in ceremonies don't know what tradition they're sitting in. I thought it's kind of really exotic. So people, you might want to get informed, when you're sitting in an ayahuasca tradition, where are you? Who are these people? What is the tradition? And, where do they come from? Where does the medicine come from? Who taught the leaders, and so forth? I guess my question to you is really generic. Like, what are you trying to find with your research? Are you trying to see if ayahuasca heals, or what is your ultimate drive?
So there's been this explosion of circles that have been happening throughout the globe, and our real question was, how do we characterize what these circles are like? What are the people that are seeking these circles like? And so I didn't get the chance to explain. We had a very broad mix of circles. So we've had large retreat centers like Soltara that are working with Indigenous practitioners. We're working with Heroic Hearts, which is a veterans-based program that flies veterans down to Peru. And we're also working with a mix of churches in the US. And so the idea was, what is the mix of circles and their experiences? how does that mitigate or impact outcomes as well? You know, one of the centers that we work with is a facilitator training program in Venezuela. It's a 2-year university you go to, and once you graduate, you can do a 400-person online ceremony, and you're mailed ayahuasca pills to take it in your home. And this is a gigantic university churning out tons of facilitators, and they also do some like 5 to 10 people in-person retreats in Europe, so that's what we were actually looking at. But do their participants have the same kind of outcome as participants with more, you know, robust experience and training? So really just characterizing and understanding, you know, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, and I have a question for you too, Kate. It's a bit similar. Ultimately, what led you to... First, I really want to say that I thought it was so interesting, a study about personality of shamans, because that's a topic that is, as I said, in the Radio Pasillo, in the hallways radio, is one of the topics that we talk more about, which is the problematic, sometimes, figures that exist in the community, and also the characters, for good and worth, that exist in this field. And we know so much firsthand, but I haven't seen yet a study specifically about personality traits, so I thought that was really original. What is your... Also, what are you trying to look? Are you trying to create awareness? I mean, I know that ultimately science is supposed to be neutral, but we also know that people have their agenda, so I'm trying to find out what is your secret agenda.
Well, I think as I mentioned, I have a background in forensics, in profiling, and I did a lot of work with...
Hey, you want to come here?
Oh, yeah, sure. Sorry. Yeah, so I used to do research with cults, and particularly cult leaders, and I felt in my own sort of anecdotal experience and speaking with people who've sat and had not the best experience, that I was seeing maybe potential overlaps as they started describing the people that they were sitting with, and characterizing them. And I thought, with so many circles going on, with so many people turning to these medicines, like, I really wanted to characterize some of the people who are serving, and yeah, to spread awareness ultimately, to maybe highlight that there might be some people who have pathological, personality profiles or things that we should be aware of. It's definitely not to dissuade anyone from seeking help if that's what they are looking for, but more just to characterize and get a sense of who's doing this work.
I'm so sorry that we're at time. I just want to give you all the opportunity to say one final thing, very briefly. What do you hope folks can take out of today's session, or a call for action, or how can they reach you? Let's go one by one, starting by Nick.
I would encourage people to read more about Cipropacma, which was the name of the organization of the 3 members of the video talking, and Heriberto Prado Pereda, who was the man in the middle. He's a Mazatec intellectual and poet, and he's got lots of work online, which is really important, because through his poetry, he's kind of re-socializing the mushrooms in the face of the kind of reification that they've undergone. So that's a tip from me, if anyone's interested.
Sorry, is this going to come up? I would just say, I think when turning to these medicines, just to be really thoughtful about who you might sit with, get references, ask them about their experience, ask them how long they've been doing this, ask them if they have protocols if anything goes wrong, and interview them as much as they might screen you.
Boy. Selena?
Yeah, so I would just encourage everyone to be really critical of the data and headlines that we're reading. I think we just assume that these medicines are a cure-all, and in reality, we don't have the answers for every individual who's seeking them out, especially those who are sick. So just be thoughtful when someone asks you about, horizons, should I sit for a ceremony, reflect and think about what exactly you're saying when you say, yes, it's great, it changed my life,
Well, I just want to say thank you, and I think to come back to my social identity as a white male, I think my hope is that people are more aware of the power dynamics that they're participating in. So for me, I have to be aware of that, because anytime that organizations in the global north seek to create relationships with indigenous communities, with marginalized communities, there is a power dynamic, there's a power imbalance. And so if you don't build the structure to be ground up, to be grassroots, to be controlled by the communities, then you will continue to perpetuate those imbalances. And my job as director of this program is just to ensure that the control of the resources and the money and the projects always remains with the communities. And I hope to see other models come out of that reflect that structure. So thank you.